again. The training day that we spent together is always quite full on, and I appreciate just how much there is to take in on the day. I also know that sometimes there's a time gap between the training and you being able to put it into practice in your own program. So what I've done here is to put together a kind of whistle-stop tour of the day, which I hope you can use to review what we did, either in one sitting or manage it in small bites. I hope it's useful, and we'll get started on this short presentation. So, swimming is different. You know, there's so much to explore and discover in what is really a unique environment, especially if you're a youngster going into the pool for the water for the first time. I like to think of it as an almost magical world, really, where children can discover physical possibilities which at first might seem impossible. And that's a voyage of discovery. And I think that voyage of discovery is really best travelled through play and exploration. There were 4 sections to your pre-course preparation. Most people found it fairly straightforward and doable. And don't forget, you still have access to those materials. For safety policies, risk assessments, etc., much of this is done for you if you use a local leisure pool. But if you hire privately or have your own pool, remember you will have greater responsibilities. Apart from the obvious responsibility which comes through our duty of care, there are of course strict legal responsibilities as well, so it's well worth being aware of those. There is evidence that your own experiences and perception of swimming can influence the way you think about any involvement you have in your school swimming program, particularly in what you think you have to offer. Now, I'm an optimist, and I believe that we can change those perceptions. I mean, one of the best things about teaching swimming is that you get to share the success and the progress of your swimmers and pupils on their swimming journey in a quite unique way. And in many ways, it's unique because at the same time, it can be your journey as well. So, we looked at a number of things which you had the details for. And all of those, as I say, were covered in the pre-course training. We then met for a busy classroom-based day with a practical pool session at the end of that day. The outcomes for the day were given in the pre-course information, so I won't go over them again here. But let's remind ourselves, many children would not get this opportunity if we didn't offer it at school. So it really is an opportunity which is truly inclusive in ways that out of school paid lessons are often not. It's not always practical for many children or many families to get to swimming lessons after school. So journey, yes, but several contexts and many outcomes. I suggested that it's not just swimming, that there are many narratives and perspectives. These days, of course, we're much more aware of the holistic nature of development and uniqueness of every child's social, emotional and cognitive capacity and potential. Interesting that when we did the short priorities task early on, that demonstrated that actually you shared many of these perspectives, especially around holistic and whole child development. In the past, we've had conversations with the originators and creators of the Real PE programs, and their view is that this swimming training that we offer here aligns very well with Real PE programs, and that's something worth mentioning if you are one of those schools that have Real PE. So we also took a closer look at the second context, if you like, the PE context. Fundamental movement skills and physical literacy is now an integrated concept and part of our landscape for delivering PE. You took a little trip down memory lane and tried to remember your journey of learning to ride a bike. in terms of physical movement skills like agility, balance and coordination, but also the emotional, cognitive and other personal qualities, skills and attitudes that were involved in that journey, from day one with trainer wheels to when some of us tried riding, hey look, no hands. On the training day, we also reminded ourselves that a huge aspect of acquiring physical motor skills is the opportunity to practice and repeat our efforts and our attempts. In the next section, we touched on some aspect of that, pardon the pun, which is around proprioception and touch. But before that, we spend a little bit of time looking at the third context, and the third context I refer to as aquatic science, if you like. We completed a tabletop activity with some 30 different images and pictures, mostly of people, animals and things moving in water. So not rocket science, but science all the same. I always think of the world of aquatics as Waterworld. And in Waterworld, whether we like it or not, we are subject to the properties and behaviour of the water we're going to move in. We considered the implications of many of them. It's 800 times more dense than air, for instance. It definitely clings to us as we move through it, and of course it resists us, and so on. So we want our learners to be able to make their journey more successful. We want them to make it easier and less tiring and less frustrating. And so being aware of those things is going to contribute a lot to that. Now then, different science, but nevertheless aspects of scientific evidence. Swimming is sensational in more ways than one. So our skin, which gets wet and cold sometimes in the water, is well exposed usually in the water. And after all, it is our biggest organ. The little guy top left is a representation of what we would look like if we focused on the distribution of tactile receptors around our body, for instance. We talked about sensory processing and integration, which is the way that our nervous system and our brains receive, organise and respond to all those sensory inputs from our bodies and from the environment that we're in. Recent awareness about, for instance, stuff around neurodiversity offers this aspect of learning to swim a number of perspectives, really, which we can't go into huge detail here, but they're very useful when we consider the reactions of many children in the water. So feel for the water is something every major text or work about swimming will mention at some time, and that's because it's something that we can acquire and develop. Streamlining is a great example because we can feel and see water flowing around us and others when we're watching them, and it gives meaning to words like what we feel gives meaning to words like smooth, flowing, slippery and sleek. We can feel and see and hear disturbed and troubled water around us. So words for that word bank would include waves and ripples, white water and splashes. The next thing on our itinerary as we went through that day was to use the 14 cards in the Small Steps resource. It's a resource that was actually designed initially for schools to use, but it can be used by all swimming teachers. And you now have your own pack to help you plan, deliver and assess in your own teaching programme. You use the principle of readiness to arrange the cards progressively. In this way, you plotted a pathway or journey from very first lesson and first visit to the pool to being ready to learn swimming strokes. One reason this activity is included is hopefully to demonstrate to swimming non-specialists, like many of the people that come on the courses, that there is really something quite common sense and obvious about the way we teach swimming. Classroom practitioners are usually familiar with concepts such as scaffolding and so on. Applying these concepts to teaching and learning in a swimming pool works. Teachers and school staff can do this with some confidence and bring it to the pool, which is what I want to say every time. The shape of the card enables or encourages a number of different arrangements. We talked about which skill or lesson focus is best planned for the start of the journey. One way to clarify that was to imagine it's your year 1, even year 3 class, which is going swimming tomorrow. What will you tell them to expect they'll be doing in that lesson? Knowing as we do that in some classes there'll be many children who've never been to a swimming pool before, ever, and others who, incidentally, as we've noted, will only get the opportunity to learn to swim because when it comes round it's part of their PE curriculum. And you ended up with a map for teaching swimming. A curriculum map, if you like, of steps or stages which can easily become a lesson planning resource if we turn each card over, where you'll find the tried and tested activities and games that we can use in the pool. You will have been sent with your own version of your map that you put together on the day. Now, both in the classroom and later in the pool, we explored a few of those key steps in more detail. Aquatic breathing was one of them, and also we looked at submersion. And we looked at examples and some ideas around that. When it comes to aquatic breathing, yes, we talked about the secret. Water doesn't go in if air is coming out. But we did say that aquatic breathing involves clearing the mouth and nose quickly and often explosively and noisily. Because aquatic breathing is proactive, it's expressive, it's noisy, and often somewhat messy. You see, bubbles, I always think, are the prettier bits of aquatic breathing. I think we should encourage children to wash and wipe and, yes, spit and blast and spray water away. And as I said at the time, I can assure you it's what swimmers do. We just don't broadcast it very loudly. Being at the surface, flat and horizontal, well, that's a no-brainer for swimmers. So our body positions are very different in swimming. And we summed it up briefly by saying, well, swimmers do it horizontally, mostly. And that was as good a cue as any to look at one of the main gateway activities on that journey of learning to swim, which is probably the first time that our swimmers, our little voyagers, are going to experience being horizontal on that journey. And we followed a lot of this up in our pool session later on in the day. While we were talking about staying horizontal, for some people with very heavy legs, that's rather difficult. So we did a quick consideration of the role of the legs for beginners especially, because aquatic breathing is not like any other kicking actions that we experience in our daily lives. It's different. Aquatic kicking is different in the same way or a similar way that aquatic breathing is different. And our question was, what proportion of total propulsion can be attributed to the leg kick, say for somebody who attempts to beat the world record for 100 meters freestyle? Thinking 60 to 80%? Why not? It's quite likely that you've seen or were in swimming lessons kicking width after width, usually clutching a float in front of you. And club swimmers do a lot of leg kick practice, that's for sure. But the facts are these, that it's around about 25% for that world record holder. And for us mere mortals who only swim for recreational fitness, it's pathetically around 8 to 12%. Another fact is that our legs evolved for a whole set of upright stuff. People use them to run 100 meters in less than 10 seconds. People can use them to jump over bars at 2 meters high and run marathons, but in the water? So it all begs the question, therefore, what is the job, what is the role of the leg kick in, for instance, front crawl and breaststroke? And we concluded that in the early stages of learning to swim, most of us only needed to kick, one, to prevent our legs from sinking. We discussed body densities, we talked about the role of muscle, and we talked about the role of body fat. And secondly, to maintain and stabilise our horizontal body position. We became aware and we talked about how that swimming is much more about upper body strength, upper body use of arms and legs, and of course aquatic breathing, where our chest and our lungs are important for buoyancy as well. So in our next classroom session, we then took a closer, if brief, look at what we mean by safe self-rescue, which is one of the curriculum requirements. And it's invariably selected as a priority when schools consider the most important outcomes for their programme. And you tried the exercise earlier and came up with those priorities. In one survey, 78% of parents were completely unaware of the self-rescue requirements. So no surprise maybe that in Sport England's Active Lives survey in 2018, they found that 66% of children couldn't perform self-rescue. Just a reminder that you do have the links for both presentations from the pre-course reading and the preparation, which looked at water safety and self-rescue, and I urge you to revisit them for a more detailed review of this topic. But the stats all tell their own story, and on our day we did spend some time considering a number of factors. First of all, we looked at what we meant by swimming, and you came up with your own definition, and surprise surprise, that definition was quite a useful one and drew on the fundamental or aquatic skills that we've been looking at when we did our curriculum map. Next, we explored the skills and competencies we thought would feature in improving someone's chances if they found themselves unexpectedly in water which they couldn't stand up in, which I've always considered to be the image I've got in my mind around safe self-rescue. When we compared it with our definitions of what we needed to be a swimmer, there were great similarities, and it was more or less the same set of aquatic skills. The outcomes and acquired aquatic skills for learning to swim, it turns out, align closely with those for safe self-rescue. But which water-based situations in that definition or in those requirements are we actually preparing for? And we came to that quite quickly after this. Because in terms of planning, maximising time and other resources, the suggestion was that we could put both learning to swim and self-rescue together in the same programme. And then we could look at what we meant by different water-based situations. This honestly is the kind of problematical statement which seems wide open to question the more you look at it, and it sits there in the national curriculum as one of the most important of the three, especially if you ask teachers and parents. So how do we work out what is meant by different water-based situations? Because who knew? The situations which come most immediately to mind for most of us involve what are actually referred to as open water situations. They're outdoors, in rivers, canals, lakes, and at the coast. And involving who exactly? Experts all over the world now agree that the confidence and competencies learned in a structured, protected, warm pool context will be severely and dramatically tested in the life-threatening event which is characterized by that sudden accidental immersion outdoors in water too deep to stand up in. Schools have to plan, manage and assess learning, not just for swimming but for all their programs. And if we, and parents certainly do, want our learners to have confidence in applying the aquatic skills and competencies they learn in our swimming lessons, then there's strong evidence that for that to happen, learning needs to be relevant and contextualized in terms of what is most likely to be experienced in the real lives and in the real world of our learners. At which point, we kind of might become aware of what I call the elephant in the room, namely that firstly, primary age children are underrepresented in the statistics for fatalities and drowning, and secondly, given the likely scenarios that we start to look at. So exactly which aspects of safe self-rescue are we going to decide we can reliably assess in context in school PE swimming lessons programs? Because as more and more people are now aware, the real kicker in the critical in critical water-based conditions is much more likely to be something called cold water shock. All waters around the UK are considered cold enough to induce cold water shocks, even in high summer. And all evidence shows that people's ability to swim in cold water is much less than their ability to swim in warm water in a protected environment of the swimming pool. So should there be a conversation, is the question, when it comes to self-rescue, about which aspects of self-rescue can we reliably and realistically teach and assess in a curriculum PE lesson? Actually, it's going to be your call, but hopefully a more informed call as a result of these considerations. We did check on the float poster, which many of us are now familiar with from the RNLI Respect the Water campaigns, which are held every summer. Swim England and the RNLI run an excellent programme each summer, by the way. It's called Swim Safe, and you can check that out, and I'll put some links at the end. And on that poster, the FLOAT acronym featured on the poster kind of says it all in terms of what we might be able to do at some stage in our programme for many of our pupils. And even then, I would suggest that this needs to be backed up with classroom sessions covering lots of other aspects of water safety guidance and advice, especially that locally. The story of 11-year-old Ravi is worth sharing with Year 6 maybe. He was caught in a riptide on holiday and remembered the float advice, and it saved his life. The help and huddle aspects of personal survival are still recommended in Swim England guidance, and yet both of these require personal flotation devices or available objects which they can use which are floating to help them. And again, there's food for thought, the extent to which we would include those or might be able to include those in our lessons as relevant. So in concluding this detour, we've offered some support here for delivering the key skills for safe self-rescue, and this particular one can be found on the website. Links have been sent to you and they're going to appear at the end as well. But basically it looks at aquatic skills that we've discussed and how we can put them into self-rescue contexts. Also, a number of the cards are connected to safe self-rescue in the Small Steps resource. So at this stage in the day, what had we covered? 5 things that we said we should know by now. A lot about the water, how to keep children safer, how the readiness principle applies to teaching swimming, knowing that the core or fundamental aquatic skills need to be put in place, that there are no shortcuts, because shortcuts mean short change, and you wouldn't dream of taking shortcuts in your literacy or numeracy programs in school. And we also looked briefly then, as we've just covered, at how we might be able to improve the outcomes of children following an accidental, unintentional submersion in water too deep to stand up in. That brought us to what we actually need to know next. And what we needed to know next on our day is all around strokes. Travel and movement in the water basically involves learning strokes. So we came up with our own definition of swimming earlier, looked a bit like this, and it's not far off the definition that we would use to emphasize where strokes fit in. Before we actually look at the strokes bit, I wanted to just underline something about where we've got to so far in that aquatic skills progression that we've looked at. So yeah, we got children to go horizontal for the first time with their star, tuck and pencil shapes and floats, and then they did streamlined push and glides using that pencil float shape normally on their front and on their back, and in a sense that's balance, and that's that balancing on the move, if you like. And then we got them to add a leg kick, and then we introduced push and glide and kick and roll. We also found that many children started to use their arms for propulsion. Now, if we step back a little bit and start to look at that, we can start to see that there are some patterns there. So in this early stage, we're looking at, albeit static, horizontal, but body positions or body shapes. Once we get them push and gliding, this is a narrow body position, and this is on the move now, so it's a dynamic aspect of the body position. But then we added leg kick to keep the body stable and horizontal, and then finally we introduced the arms and the hands to be used as paddles. And when they were rolling over, that meant the swimmers had to time taking and holding their breath, especially if we asked them to do several rotations in the water. And that being able to take us a few steps back is really quite important. If we take a step even further back, then we're going to take an analytic look, if you like, at behind the scenes. What's actually going on with our body parts in the water as we try to stay at the surface and move about at will. So what we're looking at here then are the basic components stripped back: body position, leg actions, arm actions, breathing techniques, using timing and coordination to put it all together to get to where we want to be or to do what we want to do in the water. And we sum it up by using the capital letters for each of them, BLABT, and we just call that or refer to it as BLABT. And we're going to get used to seeing BLABT as we move on and consider strokes. As if we needed a reminder at this stage, yes, we need to stay at the surface, floating confidently. It's usually a horizontal body position which works best. The urge to kick the legs is quite natural, so let's recommend it. And it's no surprise that swimmers soon discover that to get moving with any real purpose and direction, they're going to use their arms. And then they're going to work out a way to keep breathing regularly and easily so they don't have to keep stopping to get their breath back. In fact, if you could put it very simply, you might say that strokes were really about the propulsion of a stable, balanced and horizontal platform, the platform being our horizontal body position. And we know that we can stabilise that with a leg kick. But we also now know that to get seriously mobile, then that's going to be all about our arms and about breathing and timing. Now, after lunch on these long days, these training days can get a bit heavy, so that tends to be a good time to get up on our feet, which we did, and get a bit more physical. And it's the best time and the best way to start practicing our poolside demonstrations. So first of all, we looked at those stabilizing leg kicks on all 4 strokes. Now, a demonstration says to pupils, copy me or do it like this. So it needs to be accurate and representative. So for us, it's worth practicing. It's worth also noting that for the leg kick, we frequently use our arms and hands to demonstrate the alternating leg kick for front crawl and backstroke, and the simultaneous leg actions for breaststroke and butterfly. And we talked about those leg kicks and those actions that we were demonstrating as being continuous and rhythmic and steady and regular. And in the case of breaststroke, it's going to be propulsive. We also talked about where the kick originated, which is not from the knees, but tends to be around the hips or the seat. We then took a longer look at arm actions and a quick review of what we picked up from when we looked at some of the swimming science bit, if you like, because if a swimmer wants to travel forwards, then the direction of the propulsive forces is going to be backwards. And we talked about the head being the front, a bit like the bows on a boat, and the back end, like the stern, being legs and feet. And with our science head on, some of us might have remembered Newton's third law of motion, all that action and reaction stuff. And now I come to think of it, maybe that probably is a bit like rocket science, but that's the only bit. We went on then to practice our demonstrations for arms and the arm actions for each of the 4 strokes. Arm actions are first broken down into 2 phases: the propulsive bit, where the forces are accelerating under the water, and recovery, which is relaxed and over the water, which, except in breaststroke, is an underwater. And in all strokes, again, the arm actions are continuous. We talked about hand entry into the water, what we call press and feel for the water, sometimes called catch or fix. And we talked about the underwater acceleration as the hands hold the water and sweep back to exit. Finally, a reminder of what our pupils have hopefully and successfully been learning about aquatic breathing way back when they first started to develop aquatic breathing. Trickling explosive, using their mouth and nose, timed and rhythmic, because that's now exactly what they're going to need to be able to keep a stroke going without interruption. Timing it with coordinated arm movements and with leg movements. We introduced BLABT earlier. For each of the components of each stroke, body, legs, arms, breathing and timing, we use more or less standard or recognised descriptions or descriptors of the most efficient ways of applying and coordinating each component for each stroke. Swim England refers to them as expected strokes. And basically, the teaching and coaching of strokes involves breaking the stroke down to its component parts. Most resources and texts reflect this. Support for you there is well resourced. You'll find a lot of stuff on the internet, but we offer one such resource on our website, and you'll find that here, where all 4 strokes are broken down into their components with descriptions for them. There are 4 competitive strokes in international swimming, just worth picking that up and reminding you. And Swim England have produced free sheets with diagrams which you can download, and the link for that is on the screen, but it's there at the end as well. So these descriptors and these stroke analysis can be very useful, not just for planning, but also when we're delivering and on poolside, when it comes to working with our swimmers, introducing and developing strokes. And there's a summary of how we can use, how important they can be to us on the screen. As I say, we've made other resources available for you as well to be able to download quickly, and you can get these from the website. So frequently used teaching points for each stroke, what we say to swimmers as they develop and improve, and also suggested practices which we can use and activities we can use to develop and improve the strokes. So I hope you found those useful if you want to look them up. And for teaching points, you can also download some sheets with some teaching points, the ones that I use most often in teaching and coaching, and they're there as small cards if you wanted to cut them up or have them on poolside maybe for quick reference. You can also use them for your own reviewing your own strokes, and you can also use them for staff training and for follow-up. But I've just done it for the 3 strokes which are most often taught, so front crawl, breaststroke and backstroke in school programs. So tying a lot of this up, we've talked about BLABT, we've talked and looked in particular at the arms, and right from the start we want our pupils to minimise and know how to minimise resistance and drag and maximise streamlining and propulsion. Taking all of that further is probably too much for one day as we've got it, so it's another day and another short CPD, and we offer those as well. Ask if you're interested. Before we finished, we looked at current guidance from Swim Group. The Swim Group was set up in 2015 by Sport England. It published its review of swimming and water safety in 2017 or 18, and then published a number of support and guidance resources and recommendations. When we looked at the guidance for the 25 metres, I think we would agree with a lot of this. And I find this quite useful in informing how we're going to build assessment into our programme. Again, it's going to be your shout. We noted, incidentally, that it's only the second of the swimming requirements that actually refers to strokes, the strokes that we've been looking at. And as you know, probably the examples in brackets are not statutory, they're only there as examples, so it's worth remembering, and especially worth remembering when we looked at what actually Swim Group say in terms of their guidance for swimming strokes. So they talk about the effective use of strokes in terms of the required aim of each stroke and how the strokes can be adapted for purposes. And we know that for some of our swimmers, that adapted purpose is going to be for swimming fast and competitive swimming, but also for others it's going to be swimming further or swimming far, for pleasure, for fitness and so on. There's a huge list of what swimming strokes can be used for in people's lives beyond school swimming lessons. And so finally, we went to the pool session, and I think most people found it quite useful because it's extremely practical. There was a teaching sheet which we used and which you used, teaching each other, and you can find that on the website as well, along with the word bank example. So there we are. It was a busy day, but I hope it was useful. We can ensure that we can keep children safe in swimming lessons, and there's a lot of simple logic in the way that we map those strokes and those steps, and the way that we can develop and build water confidence. Once children feel safe and have learned to trust the water and their teacher, then through play, exploration and discovery, there's so much that they're going to learn for themselves, even without us intervening as teachers. So our job then is just to guide that learning process, and sometimes just to fill in the gaps as we see them. I believe that the teaching of swimming is often overcomplicated and sprinkled with myths and misconceptions. You don't have to be a good swimmer to teach swimming, for instance, but there are those around who would have you believe that. and many who believed that if you hadn't swum them competitively, you wouldn't be able to teach them. Well, to me, that's a myth and a complete misconception. Time change, things change, attitudes, priorities, approaches change, and it's as true for how we teach school swimming as anything else. Sadly, it's not always the case, and sometimes we find that change is very slow in some of the environments and where we see swimming being taught. Those who have checked out any of my insight pieces on the website will know that I firmly believe that school staff are easily the best placed professionals and practitioners to get involved in teaching their pupils how to swim and to prepare them for their next steps beyond that. I'd like to think that we started to get there with the training that we did that day, that we did together, and also because you can keep in touch, and there are other resources which we can provide you with if you're interested, and I'm more than happy to provide with those resources. So in the meantime, yes, keep in touch and lots of success in your teaching and support for school swimming. Hopefully we'll meet again soon. For now, goodbye.